And welcome back, everybody. It's time to look at a couple of the special races for the Breeders' Cup. This race that we're going to look at is the first race of the Breeders' Cup races on Saturday. It is the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. Jim Miller and Emily Gullikson joining you to take a look at the Filly and Mare Sprint. And Emily, the first thing about this race, before we even get into the field at all, the thing that has always rubbed me the wrong way about this race is the distance. 7/8 of a mile. You see, the turf sprint is either 5/8 or 5.5. The Breeders' Cup sprint is 3/4 of a mile. This is the one race that they call 7/8 of a mile. I've always felt this race should be at 3/4 of a mile. What do you make of 7/8 for the Filly and Mare Sprint?
See, I'm kind of the opposite. I love it because it's such a specialty type of
Yes.
distance, and it really makes this race so different. I mean, 5 furlongs, 6 furlongs, they kind of have their specialty, but there's a horse that's like a 7 furlong type horse. It's one that has some speed, has some stamina, is able to kind of make that middle move, is able to close, or is able to carry the speed. It's such a different type of horse. So I like that, but it does make it very challenging. And it's tough to also assess that form because most of the races are at that 6/8 distance, right? Or the horses that have gone longer. So it definitely adds a challenge, the distance.
It adds a challenge to the distance. And the one thing you have to determine is what racetracks can run the distance, because some can't. If you have that mile chute, you can. For example, Hawthorne Racecourse can't. We can only go 6.5 furlongs. Arlington Park would have been able to. You look at some of these tracks, they've been able to make alterations to some distances of stakes or just add stakes in at 7/8 of a mile to kind of become preps for this race. But like you mentioned, it's a distance that makes the race so tough, because you look at the field here, anybody in this race could have a shot in the Filly and Mare Sprint. And the one thing about this field here, and I want you to kind of educate everybody a little bit too, we talked in some of our videos about the turf pick 3 on Friday and the all turf pick 4 on Saturday. It comes down to watching replays if you want to do that, or looking at speed figures or anything along those lines. You look up and down this field. Goodnight Olive is your 3-1 favorite in here. This was a race where I went back. I watched the replay of the Ballerina. It said bumped hard at the break. I found like no bump at all in the break. There are very minimal bumps. So it wasn't bumped hard. But then in the same exact race, the same chart caller, and I thought he was right on with obligatory, said 3/4 path turn, checked at the quarter, 7 wide. And that's about what it was, because the horse came flying right out in front of this horse. So when you're watching races, everybody has to determine what they see out of a race. And that's one of the things that's very hard when watching replays. But for you, you're able to plot out a race like this and put the plots together. But I want you to explain to everybody and be able to do it by taking a look at the plots. When you're looking at these optics plots, what you see in a race, especially like this.
Well, we have the plot up for this race, which does help. And there's a lot going on. So when we're handicapping in general, we kind of go back to basics, kind of that old school way, right? We're looking at speed, we're looking at class, we're looking at form, which is, as you mentioned, kind of that combines your trip work replays, and then we're looking at pace. And I think sometimes there's certain races where you kind of go maybe heavier in one direction than another, right? A race that's a lot of first-time starters, it's very tough to do pace because they haven't developed their running style. But a race like this, where you have the Filly and Mare Sprint, you have all these horses that have established form. They're all quality types. They've been running in graded stakes races. Trip and pace just makes such a factor in these type of races. We've seen it. You can go back historically. It's not always the best horse that wins the Filly and Mare Sprint. Maybe CC was, well, I think actually CC actually benefit from the trip last year. Now I think about it, because she sat right behind that duel and got first run. But the pace just makes this race. And so we have Optics plot pulled up. And the first thing, as far as like looking at the plot, we look at a lot of different factors. We want to kind of see how the horses line up. And you can see the horses line up on that diagonal that starts on the top left-hand corner and goes down to the bottom right. So what that tells you is we can kind of interpret this plot fairly well. It's not too chaotic. These horses kind of run the same way. We can determine that race shape. And then one of the other things that we talk about in terms of the early pace in these sprints, because there's two ways to look at it. There's contention, where how many horses are going to be on or near the lead. And then there's the speed of like, how fast are they going? So in this particular race, and you can see it on the plot, we have that contention in quadrant 1, where you have a lot of those horses Just trying to do a quick count, but it looks like seven of the 11 horses in this field, 12 horses in this field, 13 horses in this field are above or sitting in that quadrant 1 position. So it looks like there should be some contention, horses that want to sit on or near the lead. At the same time, the speed rate looks a little bit lower. So we have that par line, that kind of dotted line that goes horizontal. And with most of the field that's below that par line, what that's telling me is, yeah, there's going to be horses that can be on or near the lead, but they're not necessarily going to go fast. So there is a scenario where a horse that is somewhat forwardly placed can still win. Now, at the same time, it does get complicated because there is that contention. So a horse that both you and I like, Obligatory, the 7, who's kind of that closer, and the square represents a strong finishing kick. A lot of times with closers, we think they need a fast pace to close into, but that's not necessarily the case. When you can get a bunched up field that allows a lot of separation for the closer to just kind of have that free run and swoop. So when we look, we kind of go back to, putting our picks up, we kind of go through this race. I kind of looked at it from sort of those 2 pace scenarios, right? Where I can see a scenario where they do bunch up and Obligatory can make that run. But I also wanted to look at some horses that are on or near the lead. And we can see the morning line favorite in here, which is number 8, Goodnight Olive. One of the things we want to do when we're assessing that favorite is to kind of see, the strength, like how strong. And obviously that's a good plot where they're in quadrant 1 as a square. So that's showing me this horse has some tactical speed and finishing ability. But if by default, if you like the 8, you almost have to love the 5, who's a bigger price and looks almost identical. So the plot can kind of tell you so many things, but then also kind of start to jump out some value.
And that's the thing about it is trying to decipher everything, because you make a very good point there. Contested pace and fast pace are 2 very different things. And a bunched up field, like you mentioned, kind of determines one thing for how a horse can run compared to if horses are just winging it out there on the front end. But this is a really interesting thing to see out of this pot, because there are so many horses, like you mentioned, Emily, all in that quadrant 1. They're all going to be bunched up, and it could be a very cool race. And this is one of the things where maybe the 7/8, which I was just knocking, makes all the difference in the world here, because all of these horses could be hitting the top of the lane. You're 5/8 of a mile in, you have a quarter of a mile to go. And then it comes to a horse like Obligatory, a horse like Cece saying, where are we going to move our way through? Are we going to swoop? Are we going to go through on the inside? What's going to be the winning trip? But when you're looking at a plot like this, what comes out of you at the end? Is it the fact that, hey, you probably don't want to be right there 1-2 early on and you want to come from out of it? What does something like this show you when you see a plot with that many horses in quadrant 1?
Yeah, you start kind of running through some different type of scenarios, right? But as I mentioned, that contention does assist a horse like Obligatory, where she might not have the fast pace to close into, but all those horses bunching up, it creates kind of like that stressful situation, right? Like when you're in a packed elevator and you're like, let me just get to my floor and get out of here. That puts a lot of extra stress on a horse without actually having to go fast. And so you have a horse like Obligatory who's going to be off the pace, cool air in her, breeze, like just, biding her time. And we know, she's got that big kick, big square, strongest late pace figure in the field, that she's gonna outkick these horses, and she's quality too, as she's proven. She's been able to run at this type of longer extended sprint distance, and at the top level. Now, as far as that early pace, you start looking at, this is where like post position can start to come into play, where we don't want to necessarily look at posts like as far as results record, but looking at these 2 horses that booked in the field, like Slammed doesn't have many options to try to rate.
Right.
They're going to have to go. She's done her best running where she's on or near the lead. And probably another horse that this 7 furlongs, regardless, is going to be a test for her, right? Yep. Even if she was kind of lone out there, that would still be kind of that hanging factor. And then you have a horse like Echo Zulu, who has the opposite, right? Where she's on the outside. She's going to have to use to clear. That can be a negative, but because the speed rate isn't necessarily fast, she won't necessarily have to go super fast in order to get there, and could actually benefit her kind of being to the outside, especially if those horses kind of looks in the plot, the 2, the 5, the 8, the 12, they all kind of just, I want to sit 1-2 lengths off, right? And then you have Echo Zulu right outside Slammed, and Echo Zulu, who's a little bit above the par line, so that's showing me she has that second turn speed coming out there, could get first run, and is a quality type.
Yeah, and Echo Zulu, at least at 7/8 of a mile. It's a long run down the backside. It's a lot of time to get away from the gate and not just have to zig right over to the inside. You can kind of ease your way down to the inside with that run down the backside and get into the mix. Now, Emily, we're not going to necessarily give picks to say you have to bet these horses here, but you talk about a race like this, and there's some horses that you want to make that determination of what do you want to see price-wise. We've mentioned obligatory time and again. This is a horse that's 8-1 in the morning line. To me, if I get 8-1, I think that's a good enough value in this race. What would you make of obligatory? What would the number have to get down to for you to say, I'm not quite sure at this point? And is 8-1 a good enough value for you?
I think that's very fair. And I mean, you do always want some value when you have a closer, because as we know, closers need a lot of racing luck, especially in a full field. Even with that pace scenario, still going to have to get there in time, get through traffic and all of those factors. And there should be value in here. And because it really comes down to a horse like Goodnight Olive, who is obviously capable. She can certainly win this race. You kind of noted some of the trips earlier, but she has had those favorable trips. And looking at the plot, from the plot perspective, she's also in a position where she can win, but she doesn't by any means look like a super big standout, right? So it's not. So in that case, she's a horse that I'm going to try to not key around. I can key around a horse like obligatory, because I think she will be at least, I think she will be in that 8-1 range.
I do too. Yeah, I agree with you there. And it's one of those things where you want to take a look at the value here. Emily, I know you're going to be online throughout the course of the Breeders' Cup, just kind of checking in with everybody. I think this would be a perfect race for people to say, hey, let's watch all the way up till post time, because I'm sure this is a race for you on a wagering aspect. You would probably try to wait as late as you can before putting your bets in, right?
Yeah. And it's, because especially if, you're going to play a win bet, you want to make sure you're getting acceptable odds, but it's just such a great race to play your exotics as well, because you can get some of these, big price horses in the mix. I mean, that aren't necessarily horses that you think are like strong contenders. A horse like Edgeway, for example.
Yep.
She's one that it's not out of the question for her to not win this race, but she's one that could just kind of save ground and just be there in second or third, and is a horse that people will ignore because they're sort of looking for that, she can't really win, but then she kind of gets forgotten underneath. And I'll also mention, I mentioned Frank's Rocket, just having the value as a similar plot, but Chain of Love coming in from Japan. I mean, these replays are very hard to find. I was able to watch the last race, only like the last part of it, and watch her Maiden race, but she has the same running style to obligatory.
Right.
Where she just kind of does that inside out sweeping run. So one I would kind of use as well, because, if I'm thinking the trip is going to set up for obligatory, she's got the same running style. I don't know how she's going to stack up, but a horse I'm going to throw in there. Were there some other long shots that you thought were like maybe not necessarily contenders, but underneath types?
You know what? I don't even want to say underneath types, because you mentioned it, and I'm glad you have it, because it's not a huge long shot. I think you get 6-1 on Echo Zulu, though, just because of the 13 hole. And I think that would be a value, too. I mean, the two horses you mentioned, Obligatory and Echo Zulu, are the two horses that I think you try to work around. You saw I had listed CC on there and Goodnight Olive, but those are horses I think I'd be better off wanting to use underneath in a race like this. Try to find that price that you can use on top. Obligatory is going to be a really good price. Echo Zulu, like you mentioned, the pace-wise, it might work out okay. I'd actually rather be on the outside in a field like this than on the inside, just because so many bad things can happen when you get stuck down on the inside. So Echo Zulu is a horse that I'm going to use as well. But Emily, that's a great way to kick off the Saturday Breeders' Cup action, the Filly and Mare Sprint. As always, if you want to check out the Optics plots, you can do so. Emily's going to have information online all weekend long through Twitter, so you can make sure you check that out as well. But that's the Filly and Mare Sprint. That's one race we're focusing on, but the last race we're going to focus on, Emily, and I don't know if there's going to be a whole lot of value in it, but we're going to have to talk about it, is the Breeders' Cup Classic. So everybody make sure they tune in to the Hawthorne YouTube channel. Get all of our information that's coming up. Make sure you check out our information on the Breeders' Cup Classic.